Dear Sunny Bergman, this will be my second attempt at trying to articulate my thoughts and feelings about the events of the 31st of October, about a month ago, when Jordan Peterson spoke at the University of Amsterdam. I intended to write you a letter afterwards, immediately, but soon found out that I needed more time. I hope you'll take it to heart that I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that it has taken me an entire month to recover from the event, having been in complete distress the first 2 weeks after the event in particular. It has been an absolutely bizarre experience for me to suddenly be approached and cautioned by both friends and family, who have more or less forced me to consider whether I should get in contact with a lawyer to deny you the permission of using footage of me for your new documentary or not. I've thought hard about this for a very long time, especially considering the rather troubling, immensely polarized times we are currently living in. But as it's not really in my nature to retract, and seeing that I do not believe I've said anything preposterous that day, I've chosen not to get in contact with a lawyer. There are, however, a few things I would like to get off my chest. I don't think I have to mention that public opinion is quite divided when it comes to Peterson, ever since he came into the limelight nationally with Bill C-16 in Canada and became more internationally known, especially after his interview on Channel 4 with Cathy Newman in the UK. What I do think is important to mention and stress, however, is that Jordan Peterson has over 500 hours of lectures available on YouTube, free to be viewed by anyone privileged enough to have a stable internet connection. On top of this, Peterson has ran a clinical psychology practice for decades. One does not have to delve very deep to find out that there's much more to Peterson than his political utterings, a fact that unfortunately seems to be either accidentally or willfully ignored by many. The reason I like to mention and stress this is because, even though one has all the right to disagree with Peterson's political stances, I think that it's unquestionable, considering the overwhelming amount of information out there on the web, that Peterson's psychological lectures have had a very positive impact on a tremendous amount of people's personal lives, which has absolutely nothing to do with politics. This brings me to the first thing I want to get off my chest. By the end of the interview that day at the University of Amsterdam, Peterson broke up in tears. As this was happening, and I'm far from ashamed to admit this, I could not help but let a few tears roll down my cheeks as well. You see, not only has Peterson, dare I say it, helped me understand my own gender identity, if you will, but bumping into Peterson's lectures about 2 years ago can be conceptualized as my first few steps on the road to recovery. I don't feel particularly comfortable sharing intimate details about my personal life, so all that I'll say is that I have had quite a strange time on this earth, marked by plenty of moments where I've seriously pondered whether it would be better off if I put an end to it. Now, I'm not special. I know that this is a reality many other people can relate to, but I wouldn't say that this reality is common. What is common, or likely at the very least, is that people finding themselves in such a situation benefit a great deal by seeing a psychologist. I waited more than 2 hours that day to hopefully get to say thanks and shake the hand of a psychologist who has helped me a great deal, but I ended up talking to a documentary maker instead. Life's weird. Now, there was a particular moment that day where I asked you, as you were filming, what you thought of Peterson breaking up in tears by the end of the interview, and how this added up to your idea of Peterson supposedly promoting some sort of aggressive, alpha male, hyper-masculine form of masculinity. You responded by saying that you find his tears forced, and even went so far as to say that you thought his tears were politically motivated. I think it's fair to assume that a particular individual might be very skilled at acting, enabling this person to fake tears quite convincingly, but I really do hope that you too would find it a bit too much of a stretch, to also suppose that every follower of Peterson must be acting if they are tearing up, or must be lying when they are writing elaborate letters to him on the internet about how his lectures have improved their lives. And this is what bothers me. The reason why I was quite tense, as I'm afraid will be seen in your new documentary, is due to this feeling I had in my gut. The feeling that you seemed to be quite convinced that you knew who all of these people were that were standing in front of you as you were filming, without showing the slightest intention to check whether this conception was actually true. If one accidentally or willfully chooses to ignore that there's much more to Peterson than his politics, it's easy to buy into the idea that the young folk that flock to him are nothing but fanatics of some sort of conservative political figure. But if one takes into account that he's actually also a trained psychologist, you might want to think twice before pointing your camera at a group of people who apparently were perfectly willing to wait a few hours for one. I can only speak for myself, of course, but I, for one, looking back on it now, Really wasn't looking for the conversation I had that day, nor was I even remotely prepared for it. Hence my distress and the feeling of having been used as soon as I got home from the event. My stomach still turns when I think of that day, and I don't think I'm ever going to talk to someone holding a camera again if I can't properly see and read their face. I hope I've learned my lesson. This brings me to the second thing I want to get off my chest. The internet is full of compilations of young people being asked a bunch of tough questions, whether political or purely intellectual, often with hilariously disastrous results. Now, whether one has to do with badly read Foucault or badly read evolutionary biology, I believe that in either case you're probably not going to get answers that are of any use. My point being, besides the concern I've tried to raise of pointing a camera at a group of people who are most likely waiting for Peterson for his psychological work rather than his political utterings, I don't think it's very fair nor productive to have gone out there and asked a bunch of hard questions as if you're casually asking a group of people how they find the weather outside. Not only are these tough questions, but also taking into account the controversy prior and surrounding the entire event, the fact that the presence of a camera is likely to make just about everyone a little nervous, and the sheer amount of people who were there, leads me to believe that this is far from an environment to appropriately research the subject you are investigating, if your intention is to find careful and honest answers, that is. It could also very well be that you found exactly what you were looking for. There's a particular moment which immediately springs to mind, where a young woman who ended up being so wise as to deny you the permission to use footage of her right on the spot, mentioned how she thought it was ridiculous that people could not see that men and women are different, that women supposedly take care of stuff while men supposedly go out to hunt, to which you responded by rather sarcastically turning to the men that were around and asking them, guys, do you hunt? Like I said, taking into account the entire rush that is triggered by the presence of a camera, the amount of people that were there, and the entire controversy prior and surrounding the entire event, combined with the nature of all the questions you asked, I find it really hard not to view this as intellectually dishonest and deliberate provocative behavior. I'm sure this particular situation is not going to be in the documentary, seeing as the person who said this denied you the right to do so, but had this not been the case, I could see how this easily could have been framed as some sort of wacky attempt by someone to justify oppressive stereotypes of both sexes. To repeat once more, I don't think there and then was the right place to discuss things such as evolutionary biology, which is bound to come up by the nature of the questions you were asking, nor do I find it fair. And anyone who actually cares about this stuff would know about the increasingly alarming situation within academia, where actual ideologically driven radicals are actively trying to push evolutionary biology as an academic field beyond the pale. The danger of the tragic and worrying events at Evergreen State College, Washington, U.S., with Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying, now two evolutionary biology professors in exile, in my view, can't possibly be stressed and talked about enough. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, I find it very curious that when you were asked to define masculinity, you said that you did not know what masculinity is because you don't think it exists. Yet, when you were asked what toxic masculinity is, you had a long, prepared answer. This is philosophically inconsistent. With all due respect, you can't say that masculinity doesn't exist while at the same time proclaiming that toxic masculinity does exist. My apologies for becoming a bit technical here, but you can't have an existent variant of a non-existent, socially constructed illusion. There's either normative behavior of both sexes, justifying the existence of the very terms masculinity and femininity, or it's all socially constructed, by which you would logically have to abandon these terms altogether, as according to this viewpoint they are totally illegitimate, are of no use whatsoever, and even become harmful. And it's quite baffling to me to have found out that this discussion has already been going on for a while, for far longer than I had ever expected. To quote Robert Moore from his book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, published in 1990, why is there so much gender confusion today? At least in the United States and Western Europe. It seems increasingly difficult to point to anything like either a masculine or feminine essence. End quote. So are you making a documentary about masculinity, or are you making a documentary about the social construction of masculinity? Take your pick. You can't have both. I take this worrying issue of philosophical inconsistency very seriously, not only because I have personally ran into conflict regarding this subject in my studies, but especially because I have suddenly found myself in a fight once with someone dear to me over the sheer fact that I was using these terms, which somehow supposedly perpetuates sexism, while these two concepts have, quite harmlessly, been of tremendous use to me and have helped me a great deal with trying to understand the creature that I am. If there's one thing I would really like to get across, it is that masculinity and femininity, in and of themselves, as concepts, are not your enemy. And anyone who claims otherwise is not heroically fighting the tyrannical and oppressive gears of the patriarchy, but socially constructed ghosts in their heads. I see that I'm already 3 pages in, which probably is a little more than I bargained for. But you must understand that it has been an absolute shock, while for years living under the impression that I did not have any dog in this fight whatsoever, to find out that, in the end, I am the dog, and neither putting my tail between my legs nor threateningly showing my teeth seem to be favorable options. Hence I'm writing you this, although rigorous and very serious, perfectly human letter. I sincerely hope my efforts aren't in vain. On a final note, I recall you stating innumerable times that you believe a lot of pseudoscience is done that is politically motivated, masquerading as real science. This may very well be the case, but the fact that there have been dozens of professors at the University of Amsterdam who have had the audacity to call Peterson a pseudoscientist should raise a few eyebrows. To quote the man himself, taken from the post on his blog that he wrote in response to the initial controversy, "With regards to my legitimacy, I have more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers as author or co-author, most often with my students, whom I most often encourage to take first authorship, with some 10,000 citations. This places me above the 99th percentile for documented influence among social scientists. ResearchGate places me in the top 2% of scientists overall in terms of influence. I was a professor at Harvard, both assistant and associated, and tenured as a full professor at the University of Toronto, an institution whose psychology department is regularly ranked in the top 5 of the world. I'll happily stack up my academic reputation and expertise against any of my erstwhile opponents at the University of Amsterdam, or anywhere else for that matter. Of course, they regard such metrics as mere indicators of the patriarchal, tyrannical, male-dominated, racist, neocolonial academic hegemony, but benefit from precisely the same hypothetically corrupt system. So I don't think this objection needs to be taken too seriously." End quote. And later on, he states in the same post, "The mere fact that most of those who are objecting to my existence cannot generate an audience that is not compelled to attend their lectures by necessity does not indicate that my comparative popularity is indicative of pure entertainment. And the supposition that those firmly committed ideologues who are opposing my views, who so often criticize science itself as nothing more than a Eurocentric, bigoted, power-hungry extension of the tyrannical Western patriarchy, can so conveniently wrap themselves in this situation in the mantle of rigorous scholarship, critical thinking, and scientific standards is laughable to a point well beyond absurdity." Really? The politically correct claiming their allegiance with objective science and rigorous scholarship? It truly is the case that truth can be stranger than fiction. And if you have no idea what he's talking about here, I'd seriously urge you to check out the following 6-minute video titled "Academics Expose Corruption in Grievance Studies." Considering my personal situation, the fact that I believe that any maker of cultural products bears a heavy responsibility and should work with a strong sense of integrity, as well as the current situation in the world at large, I hope that you understand that instead of contacting a lawyer, I felt that I had to write you this letter at the very least before your new documentary is up in the air and running. Being very high in trade agreeableness, I'm naturally inclined to choose the path of least resistance. But I also know what it's like to give way and bend over so far that you break, which is something I intend to avoid right now as well as in the future. Lastly, there is a reason why this entire event still doesn't sit well in my stomach, and I don't think I'm naive about it. I'm fully aware of the fact that some of the things I've said in this letter, let alone the parts you may or may not have chosen to include in your next documentary, may push people to consider themselves my enemies, even though these hypothetical enemies would have no idea of who I am or where I come from. I must admit that I'm not particularly excited about this, but alas, there's only so much one can wish for. But if there's one tiny wish I could have granted, however, I'd wish for the following quote to be true. An old alchemist gave the following consolation to one of his disciples. No matter how isolated you are and how lonely you feel, if you do your work truly and conscientiously, unknown friends will come and seek you. If this is true, I look forward to meeting them.